Hello, how are you all doing? Are you having a good time at this festival? It's good, isn't it? I'm excited. I just saw the poet Daniel Lusk, and that was fun. And I was realizing, wow, poets really, and writers, they really write about very diverse subjects. But thank you so much for that introduction. I realized that when you spoke of my teacher, really that's how I did begin. I was in college, and I was taking poetry workshops, and a professor of mine really kind of saw my future and saw that I was going to be a poet one day. And that's what great teachers do. They see things before you see things. So he kind of clued me in on what I was going to be in the future. And in the introduction, it was also mentioned that I became the Poet Laureate of Brooklyn in 2010. Now, when that happened to me, it all came as such a surprise. It all came to me when I was about 40 years old, and I just had my first child when I turned 40. That was something that I didn't think would ever happen to me. I just thought it was done, it was over, it wasn't going to happen. And here I was with my first child, and the next thing that happened to me, it basically just came to me that they named me Poet Laureate. So it all came as a surprise. And sometimes I get the question, what do you do as a Poet Laureate? Does anybody have any idea what a Poet Laureate does? You know, the most recent U.S. Poet Laureate is Natasha Trethewey. What do you think? Does anybody know what a U.S. Poet Laureate does, or what a Poet Laureate does? Just sort of curious.
Promote poetry.
Yes, promote poetry. So it kind of began in Britain, where there were the Poet Laureate was sort of spoken for by the royal monarchy, and they used to write poems for very special, important occasions, such as the birth of a baby, somebody getting married, a coronation. So the poet would sort of give the event its weight. And as it made it here over to the United States, it's kind of changed over time, where it's now sort of self-described and self-shaped and self-formed. So you're absolutely right, so it's to promote poetry. So I had to decide when I took on this role, how was I going to promote poetry? So I went back to, and I'm so glad it was mentioned in the introduction, because I went back to the words of my professor. You know, he saw before I saw what I was going to be. So now I am trying to bring poetry to students, to young students. I started off with middle school students. And why middle school? When I think the age, if you remember back, the age of 10, 12, 13 is such an odd age. You're just on the cusp of being somewhat of an adult. You're trying to understand the sort of movement from childhood to adulthood. So I feel like it's such a nice time to catch that age group. They're really just beginning to understand and learn what they're in love with. And I remember right at that time I had the most fantastic teachers who kind of led the way. I'm going to get to my poetry, I promise. The first poem really kind of struggles with that difficulty of having taken on this role of being a poet, or anybody who's a career person, and also having a child. My child had gotten into an accident, and I wasn't there, so I had a tremendous amount of motherly guilt that I wasn't there when something happened to him. And then on top of that, I had a poetry reading I had to go to right away, so I had to make this decision. And it was very hard to go and honor my professional engagement, but I did do that. But I wrote this poem called The Chase. I run my finger along the stitches on my son's forehead, which are train tracks heading west. Yesterday, my son ran through his life. Feet pounded the rubber below his feet. Summer edged itself out of the mouth of the season's last sprinklers. Wind carried his body forward as he was chased by a dark-haired girl with the face of a Russian doll. As he turned, he glimpsed her tangled hair, taken by the image of her berry mouth, stained with jam. He felt the promise of her pursuing him, the girl he loved, the girl he might one day choose to love, the past and future colliding as he crashed into the lamppost ahead of him. This is the day's punch and soar, the moment's thump and shatter. I'll take it, he said, and plunged forward like a locomotive into the unknown before him. his forehead splitting open. The blood that spilled down became miniature thought bubbles spreading on her shirt. I'm not there, but still, I open my mouth to warn him. I'm not there, but I imagine all the good fathers leaning over him to offer a shirt, a towel, anything to stop the blood. He breaks into a cry, which is just another version of the heart's fracture. And there he sat with his father, who held his large and calloused hand to his son's head, as if the hand itself could stop the hurt from coming, as if it could serve as a bandage to the wound a woman might someday inflict, the many opportunities for the heart's peril and disaster. My son laid on the ground, looking at the great lamppost that defeated him. Viewing the sky from his fallen position, he noticed that from his perspective, the birds and the airplanes were just about the same size, and how they flew past one another as if sharing an understood pattern of skill and grace. The breaths of birds, the engines of the machines traveling at breakneck velocity, wings venturing so close to one another that it would seem that the only outcome was collision. If love is this, I want to be witness to it. A new wind, new territory, love out of proportion, the largeness and the smallness of things, rummaging in the same hemisphere, risking damage, sacrificing all for the inevitable and furious impact. I love looking out at you because I can't see any of you. I can't see a thing. But I can see the shadow of you, and that feels very poetic to me. I could sort of see you. I see your lovely hair, the silhouette of your hair. And I can sort of see if you're looking back at me. I can't tell. Somebody on the way over asked me, there's this lovely man who drove me over from the airport to the Burlington Book Festival. He's like an actual driver. It wasn't like hitchhiking or anything like that. He asked me a question which a lot of writers get asked a lot is, well, who are your influences? Who do you read? Who should I read? Who do you love? And this is oftentimes a very hard question for anyone. If somebody asked you, who do you read? Who do you love? And maybe the same people might come up over and over, but we're all constantly changing. So our interests change. Our moods change, so the reading sort of shifts and changes as we shift and change. Well, one poet, and maybe you know him, if you know poetry, you probably love him. I would like to think that you love him. His name is Jack Gilbert. Oh, if you don't know him, you have to read him. He died very recently, but before he died, his collected work came out. I was introduced to his work maybe about 20 years ago as I was just beginning to take poetry very seriously. And back then I didn't know a thing. So when my poetry teacher introduced me to his work, I just thought it was very sentimental. It was all about love, and I thought, what is this love stuff? I don't need to hear so much of it. So I think that I let some years pass. And then as the years passed, I thought about him more and more. I thought, well, who is that young woman who didn't like the work of this man, because it is so wise. So in that book, there's a book called The Great Fires. And in The Great Fires, the speaker, who is essentially Jack Gilbert, loses his wife named Michiko Nagami. And the book really ponders the loss of her. And he cannot get over her. He cannot get over the loss of her. I don't think we ever get over the loss of anybody. I was thinking about that today. I think we might have an easier way of coping with it in the outside world to seem like we're okay, but it very is hard. It's very difficult to actually deal with the loss. And this one, this is not in The Great Fires, but it's a poem that I have a tendency to go back to again and again. It's called Failing and Flying. Some of you may know this poem. Failing and Flying by Jack Gilbert. Everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. It's the same when love comes to an end, or the marriage fails and people say they knew it was a mistake, that everybody said it would never work, that she was old enough to know better. But anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Like being there by that summer ocean on the other side of the island while love was fading out of her, the stars burning so extravagantly those nights that anyone could tell you they would never last. Every morning she was asleep in my bed like a visitation, the gentleness in her like an antelope standing in the dawn mist. Each afternoon I watched her coming back through the hot, stony field after swimming. The sea light behind her and the huge sky on the other side of that. I listened to her while we ate lunch. How can we say the marriage failed? Like the people who came back from Provence when it was Provence and said it was pretty, but the food was greasy. I believe Icarus was not failing as he fell, but just coming to the end of his triumph. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. She's so good. Oh gosh. So I thought I would also continue on with some of my poems from my first book. The first book and the second book are really different. The first book was really dealing with the death of my father. He died when I was very young. And when a person dies when you're that young, I should say for myself, I shouldn't say you, as in you, but when my father died when I was very young, I was constantly in search of him. I was always trying to find him everywhere I looked. And so I would look for him in the bookstore, in my dinner, on a shelf. I just thought that he could be anywhere and everywhere. I returned back to the country of his birth, which is Taiwan. I tried to search for him there. I think I found him there. But this is called invention. So in the book, he kind of comes back as God, as a dog, as so many different things, as a way for me to visit with him again. Invention. On an island, an open road where an animal has been crushed by something larger than itself. It is mangled by 4 o'clock light, soul sour sweet, intestines flattened and raked by the sun, eyes still watchful, savage. This landscape of Taiwan looks like the body, black and blue. On its coastline, mussels have cracked their faces on rocks, clouds collapse onto tiny houses, and just now, a monsoon has begun. It reminds me of a story my father once told me. He once made the earth not in 7 days, but in 1. His steely joints wielded lava and water and mercy and great ionic perfection. He began the world hammering the length of trees, trees like a war of families, trees that fumbled for grand gesture. The world began in an explosion of fever and rain. He said, "Tina, your body came out floating." I was born in the middle of monsoon season, palm trees tearing the tin roofs. Now, as I wander to the center of the island, no one will speak to me. My dialect left somewhere in his pocket in a nursery book, a language of child's play. Now everything unfurls in pictures. A woman runs toward her weeping son. Chicken bones float in a pot full of dirty water. I return to the animal on the road. When I stoop to look at it, smells of trash, rotting vegetation, the pitiful heart, claws, eyes open, eyes open. When the world began in the small factory of my father's imagination, he never spoke of this gnarled concoction of bone and blood that is nothing like wonder, but just something simply ravaged. He would die soon after the making of the world. I would go on waking and sexing and mimicking enemies. I would go on coaxed by gravity and hard science while he rested in the satin of his skin, eyes swollen to exquisite planets. So there are 2 fathers in this book. There's one that's my father that I just spoke of, and there's a stepfather. And the stepfather I didn't really have such a great relationship with. He was a man who was very silent. I don't know if you have a relative like that, just a person of silence. And when And when he did speak, it was never quite very positive, so we never quite had that good relationship. And this next poem called Fish Story, we're at the dinner table. And because when they're usually at the dinner table, there is conversation, sharing the news, talking about the happenings of the day, exchanging jokes, hopefully at a good dinner table, and that wasn't happening here. So as a result, we sort of substituted with eating, hopefully good food. So it's called Fish Story. And in the Chinese culture, like the fish is really important, very important, life-giving animal. Fish Story. It is the hour of news. The television cracks its voice over the radiator and the blue carpet. Always that same cooked silver of you. Oil spilling from the mouth, ginger and scallions burning through the scales. My father thinks you're delicate as he steals the eggs from the purse of your belly. White interior exposed and steaming. I think of you breathing before the slipping out. You once slept on a bed of cracked shells, jellyfish swelled around your eyes, your body weaved through coral. Cold blood stained the air when you were caught, the snails and the clouds erasing. Netting grasped the whole of you, the back bending so completely it could snap as water escaped your yellow heart. Rubber tires and shrimp, green glass and mollusks were caged with you. I know how painful it can be, the blade and the quick gutting, the aroma of yourself frying in a smoky haze, your body covered with radishes and leafy greens. This activity of eating brains is real. The knowledge of abalone and barracuda, the stingray, can be transferred by licking the flowers from inside the skull of a fish. The bowl of the sea and all its blue water, amphibians, salty mammals can be absorbed in one swallow, and so my father does this with hope. As his sight diminishes, he pushes out your eyes with his thumb. You see the dry, contained world in this white room as he sucks you down. This is the last of the swimming, the final melting of fin and gills, life broken down by the sallow tongue and feverish saliva, the salt and sauce defeating you. So I'm just going to skip ahead. Right after I got my MFA, I decided very quickly to move to San Francisco, and I quickly also decided that I was not a San Francisco girl. I think I was a little too cynical to belong there, so I made my way very quickly back to New York, and I didn't have a place to live, so I asked my brother if I could stay with him, and at the time he just got married, and he was just trying to start a family. And what I learned is if you're trying to start a family, you don't want your sister in the house in the next room. So my presence really wasn't appreciated at all. And I really started missing the days that my brother and I were very close, and I was sort of like his number one girl. This is called Naming the Light. Naming the Light. My beautiful brother opens the garage door on a Saturday morning, taking out the tools to rake the leaves around the gated house. He hates this job, but does it anyway, the way he makes his breakfast before daylight. He gets up as my father would, without question. The idea of infinity haunts me, the dark days boundless. My brother raking the leaves on an autumn day equals the loneliness I feel waking up on my mattress, the light not light yet. My brother that comes in from the cold now is the same brother that came in from the snow 20 years ago, pounding his boots to wet the carpet, pieces of frost clinging to his winter hat. Taking off his gloves, he lets the house warm him. The idea of the present is that we will last, or that the minutes might outlive us, that the universe within each veined leaf will surpass the present tense. When evening comes, lights dim from each window, a figure stands by a lamp just about to shut it. In this moment, It seems as if this job is important, that if the light fades, it will be one less marker of the night. I realign the pens on my desk as if realigning the stars. My brother once put his name on a slip of paper. In his boyhood hand, he wrote his name, Vincent, in script, the slanted letters uncertain and fragile. Today, I found his name in my pocket. So, do you ever hear of these best of lists? It's like best of everything. And you're wondering what the lists are for. I recently was looking at all these best of lists. They're helpful in some ways, because when you read the best of list, you think, well, somebody thinks that they're the best, so maybe somebody thinks they're the best, maybe I'll really enjoy this stuff. So I wrote this very new poem called The Best. I pick up the lists and peruse them. Best books of the millennium, best poets of 2013 so far, best fiction writers under 40, best poetry advocates, best of the best American poetry. I sit down and think about my days with my father, how I never knew him, but only remembered the smoke coming from his pipe, only remember him from a photo that I have of us, he in half shadow, and I on his lap, an infant, knowing nothing of the fact that death was riding a horse and it was charging for him, and it paid no heed to our will, which was the wind that parted its curtains when death's hooves pounded through our house. I take the best of lists and turn them over. I write poems on the lists and tell myself this is definitely not the best of anything, but they are here, these words living under my fingers. They breathe, their small, swollen mouths exhaling in unison. Does a horse know it is the best of its breed as its rider is lashing at its hind legs? Does it know that it is attempting to win, or does it merely know that there is rest on the other end of its owner's ambition? Does a rock know it is a rock, held in the hand of the boy who at day's end has decided to collect the mineral-flecked stones for no purpose at all but to feel their weight, their edges grazing his palm, and to place those stones neither best nor notable on his windowsill? What does the stream strive for as it moves its way downward beneath the birch, under the hanging fingers of branches, reaching down as if to touch the stream, its sleeping sister? And what of the fish? Does it desire to be caught by the fisherman who will value its meat flesh, or does it ignore the hook and go on pulsating in the water as one of a school of fish, then parting on its own, knowing only by instinct to dive down into the depths of something frightening and new, water rippling outward and beyond from the flash of its tail? So I'm going to move onward to, oh my gosh, it's almost time to finish. How did that happen? That was very fast. I'm going to then end on a poem if I can find it. Okay, this is my last poem. How did that happen? I'm having a very good time, obviously, up here. Milk. So I didn't want to end on something sad. I wish it was just a little bit longer, but I wanted to just talk about, there was a story in Brooklyn. I don't know if it made national news, to tell you the truth. It was definitely a very, very important story in New York. There was a little boy named Lier Foundation, and he was a little Hasidic boy in the tightly knit Hasidic community in Brooklyn. And he asked his mother if he could walk home by himself. He was 8 years old. And he begged his mother, and he until she finally gave in to him. And she repeated the path home. She went over the path with him over and over again. And he had it. He had it down. She let him lead her, and he had it. But on the day that he was supposed to walk home from school by himself, he made a turn immediately in the wrong direction when he left school. So he got lost, and he asked a stranger in his neighborhood which way to go, and he never made it home. But it was really the details of his death that was so harrowing that it's very hard to repeat now. But it was so harrowing that I couldn't let go of him in my heart, especially because I have a son of my own. At the same time, I was reading Maurice Sendak's In the Night Kitchen. Do you know this book? I love Maurice Sendak's books because they're so dark in a lot of ways. And he was dark himself. You know, he had a very intricate life. He was also a Brooklynite. I didn't know this about Maurice until researching him, that he came out to his parents. He was gay, and it was something that he almost wished he didn't have to tell his parents. This is something I never knew about him. And he wrote stories not to humor children, because he thought childhood is so dangerous that if you could make it just through on the other side, you're good to go. And so all of his stories, if you reread his children's stories, they speak to that, the journey, the dangerous journey for the child. So in the Night Kitchen, the famous line in the book is, milk in the batter, we bake cake, and nothing's the matter. This is for Lavi Kletsky. It's called Milk. In every definition of home, my son conjures milk. The sun is milk. Milk spills through the open doorways, bed of warm milk, face of milk, milk trousers, a truck full of milk, a milky light that passes through the lens of my camera. All of his young life, my son thought of milk, and he asked for it each night. And every memory I have of him, his hands are outstretched, and he's asking for his last bottle. And every version of a life, I never refuse him, though now he is too old to have this bottle in his hands. On the television, the nation listens to the story of Lavi Kletsky. Today, I think of his mother, who waited for him, allowing him for the first time to walk home alone. In that definition of home, the boy wanted to be a man. The boy promised to walk one straight line until he reached his front door. That morning, he held a key in his hand, heavy and shining, made especially for him. In the ancient story of boys, he headed up past the lone dog barking near the fire hydrant, past the circle of children careening into their own shadows, and in the ancient story of boys, he walked through his front door, and this was his rite of passage. He placed the book bag on the coffee table, and the boy and his mother sat together in the large reading chair in the living room light. But this version isn't true. Tonight, I hold my son closer. As I put on his night clothes, I'm afraid of the world. I find all the stories horrifying. In the book of nursery rhymes, the old woman sends her son to bed without food. A king beats a knave for stealing pies, and the dog cannot find his bone, though he runs in circles day after day. Perhaps if I rewrite all the old stories, a new era will begin, era of the forgiven, era of redemption, era of safekeeping. Tonight, milk stains my blouse, a love so deep it runs from me. After the old stories are finished, my son says, the story again. I open the book, the owls lift from their pages. The lake is a bowl of night milk, and this is a place so safe we are weightless, buoyant in its murky sweetness, free from a promise that each new day startles us alive.